Hello and welcome back to News from Nowhere, the show that brings you the headlines shaping Scottish politics from Scotia. My name is Coll McCail. Today is Sunday the 12th of July and I'm delighted to be joined by Rafanell-Williams. Sam, how are things?
I'm great, Coll, and good to be with you.
Great to have you. We are down Rory Hamilton this week, who's on holiday, which is very well deserved, and we'll be back next week. If you're enjoying the show and enjoying Scotia's regular content, you can find us on Patreon, where you can support the podcast for as little as the price of a pint a month. Someone did point out to me that £5 didn't get you a pint in most pubs these days. We're saying the price of an expensive coffee a month, but either or. We also have a WhatsApp channel and a mailing list. The links to both of those are in the show notes, and that's the best way to keep up to date with what we are up to. But without further ado, let's dive into the headlines. Sam, what have you got this week?
So there's been a fury as Restore UK leader Rupert Lowe described the Dunblane massacre as one murder. Lowe made the comments while appearing on the Joe Rogan podcast, one of the biggest podcasts in the world, and has caused widespread outrage for his ignorance since, far from being a single murder, 16 children and their teacher were shot dead by a gunman at Dunblane Primary School in 1996 in what remains the UK's deadliest mass shooting. A ban on most handguns was introduced by John Major's Conservative government in 1997 after the Snowdrop campaign was launched in the wake of the tragedy.
Yeah, it's a really, really grim story, that one. I'm going to come with something totally different, actually, and talk a bit about a row developing between Scottish Government Public Service Reform lead Ivan McCail, the Minister for Cuts, and the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service. Ivan McCail, talking on the Sunday show last week, stated that the Scottish Government's bid to centralise the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service and Police Scotland had saved £300 million every year. He said, "We've taken out the back office costs and redirected it to frontline services." This is interesting rhetoric because it aligns very much with this: cut red tape and remove the bureaucracy stuff, which is how the SNP are going to justify these 10,000 public sector job cuts, if not more, which are going to come as part of the public service reform agenda. So we are seeing this rhetoric beginning to be tested in some of Ivan McCail's press appearances. The Fire Brigade's union quite correctly contradicted McCail's claim of saving the service by virtue of centralisation. They pointed out that the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service has lost £840 million in real terms since centralisation, and that 1,250 firefighter jobs have been lost. So the service in a state of decline since the creation of the one Scottish Fire and Rescue Service, rather than saved, as McCail says. Sam, back to you.
Yeah, and that comes after the fire on Princess Street in Edinburgh, and after which the Scottish Regional Chairman of the FBU, Gus Spruill, highlighted the losses of jobs that the FBU suffered over the past 10 years or so. In other news, some Scottish councils were found to have misspent hundreds of thousands of pounds in Scottish Government central grants for nature projects instead on day-to-day spending. In its first 4 years, the Nature Restoration Fund, or NRF, awarded £20 million directly to Scotland's local authorities. But an investigation by the Ferret found that almost a fifth of that was redirected towards routine spending, including vehicle maintenance and buying office equipment. But because the fund was not ring-fenced when it was awarded, the spending was legal. It didn't break any terms of the Nature Restoration Fund, but environmental charities described the findings as deeply disappointing and frustrating.
Yeah, great reporting from the Ferret there. I'm going to shift gear again and bring Dundee University up for what feels like another week. It's a regular fixture in our headlines at the moment, but it is a poignant example of university mismanagement, as we all know, and that's a sector in Scotland which is on the verge of going bust. So The Sunday Mail revealed this week that Dundee University, who remember announced more than 200 job cuts as recently as June, taking the total figure of redundancies and whatnot at the university almost, I think, to 4 figures. It turns out that senior management at Dundee University spent more than £44,000 on first-class flights to places like Tokyo, Nairobi, Kuala Lumpur, Florence, and Hong Kong in the year from 2024 June to April 2025. So this is the period during which Dundee University was going through its most tumult, when things were rockiest for staff and students. And here were the senior management team flying around the world at the expense of the university first class. That £44,000 might seem like a paltry sum of money, but in the context of continual job cuts, it's more than enough to keep people in post, or at least go some way to doing so. So a grim story about continual mismanagement within the further education sector. Back to you, Sam.
Yeah, and that's not that's not an unusual story. I mean, that's the theme across the higher education sector, is the executive class within management, doling out really serious haircuts to the staff that actually deliver the quality service, whilst not appearing to take any compromises themselves. I've got one more headline, and it's another report from the Ferret. We'll get further into this in the show. But anti-immigrant activists are due to travel up from England to participate in a Glasgow protest later this month, following a week of aggravated protests across Glasgow. Unite the Clans is organising a rally at Glasgow Green on the 25th of July and is promoting the fact that other far-right groups from England, including Britain First, will travel up to Scotland to attend.
Yeah, we're going to be talking about the right a lot today, I think. My last story is tentative good news for a change, and that's the U-turn from the Scottish National Party regarding Scottish data centres. Last Sunday, the SNP's National Council passed a motion to freeze all new data centres in Scotland. That proposal has been sent to the Scottish Government for consideration, so this isn't a outright victory just yet. This is the party saying something to the government. Those two do not always align, as we well know. The SNP's democratic structures have been tested to their limits in recent years and have come out pretty poorly in terms of their influence on policy making within St Andrew's House. So I think that it is another test now as to whether the SPADs and civil servants are willing to implement the views of members of the party. Those members criticised the current plans under the National Planning Framework 4 as overdevelopment, leading to overdevelopment in swathes of the country. We've talked about data centres at length in a previous episode of News from Nowhere, so I would recommend listeners go back and dig that out, because it is worth finding a bit more out about the nature of some of these proposals, because this is the Scottish Government's industrial strategy, or at least for as long as there is no moratorium, it remains central to the Scottish Government's industrial strategy. And what's interesting is this decision followed revelations from The Guardian regarding the £8.2 billion data centre in North Lanarkshire. North Lanarkshire is, of course, part of the UK government's dedicated AI growth zone, and this particular data centre was due to be built by the US firm Coll. And what The Guardian revealed about the construction plans was that essentially they were baloney. Right, that there was no prospect of the CoreWeave construction company building a data centre which, as the proposals claimed, would be entirely dependent on site renewables by 2030. There is no way that was going to happen, found The Guardian, and instead the data centre would have to draw resources from elsewhere, and we've discussed the implications of that on this podcast extensively. So this is an important headline, I think, to finish our conversation on this week's show. I think there is lots to talk about regarding data centres, and we'll see how active the Scottish Government are in implementing the National Council of the SNP's decision. But let's move on to the substantive part of the show. We've got lots to get through in 20 minutes or so, and we're going to start, of course, with Nigel Farage's resignation from his Clacton seat. Nigel Farage has resigned following revelations regarding, of course, this £5 million gift from Thai billionaire Christopher Harborne, and not just that. Following, as we discussed, I think, with Rory last week, it turns out that he has also accepted undeclared gifts and services from George Cottrell, who supported Farage with staff for both social media and security prior to his election in 2024. So following both of these revelations and the scrutiny which they placed upon Nigel Farage, he has gone to the people of Clacton to test his legitimacy and get back his mandate. The major parties, including the Greens, have all said that they will not stand in that by-election. Sam, what did you make of Farage's stunt?
So I think when this news first broke, some were of the view that this was quite astute from Farage. I mean, I certainly was, in the sense that he could clearly see that this scandal with the $5 million donation and other issues was not going away. It was likely to deepen. And now I think, further investigations are taking place into, donations made to Reform. So the idea seemed to be that he was going to set the frame for his own by-election and make it, this battle, as he's promoting now, this battle between the establishment and the Reform insurgency, rather than it being a referendum on his character, which it maybe would have been if he was found in the parliamentary investigation to have broken rules over this stuff, right? But increasingly, I'm a bit baffled as to what his plan actually is. Because what I don't understand is why Farage thinks he's not going to have to run a second by-election, even if he does win the first. If the parliamentary investigation does in fact find that he's broken rules, and he has to stand down. It doesn't seem clear to me that he's avoided that scenario just by resigning preemptively and launching this by-election. And maybe I'm just confused about that, though, Coll. So, maybe keep me right.
I don't know. It's an interesting one, right? Because I was instinctively of your position when he first announced it, right? So goes to the country and says, this is the people versus the establishment. I'm going to take everyone on in Clacton, reassert the Reform narrative after a tough couple of weeks, the defeat in Makerfield, the defeat in Gorton and Denton, the defeat in Caerphilly, reclaim my narrative and assert some dominance in the public consciousness once again. Has it backfired? Quite potentially. The absence of a serious candidate opposing Farage looks likely. There's a world in where Reform plough all of this money into the Clacton campaign, which they obviously are prepared to do. The comms and videos Farage has produced are very, very good, very well put together. But we're in a situation just now where he's putting all of these communications together for a standoff against Count Binface, right? And that does say something about how the move has backfired, but equally, right, the idea that the establishment has teamed up not to contest the by-election, if Farage is able to spin that narrative and say these people aren't interested in coming to Clacton to contest this fight, maybe he has some success, because the grim reality of the matter is that nobody could beat him, and nobody is sure enough of their ability to beat him to contest that by-election.
Right. Exactly. And the last point I was going to make was precisely in that. So, the fact that none of the mainstream parties are running, and the idea here, the strategy is to try and embarrass Farage by delegitimizing the by-election and making him run against Binface. But, everyone's saying this is going to make Farage look silly. But I think what actually could happen is that it could end up being good television, right? Which is not exactly an arena that Farage is uncomfortable in. And we might end up seeing lots of footage of him laughing and smiling and shaking off all this sleaze. Because the thing is that Count Binface is not who anyone should want challenging Farage on political corruption, because then it becomes a joke and it becomes a theatre, And I find the idea that the Green Party are going to join the Conservatives and Labour and the Lib Dems in not standing in this by-election a bit weird, to be honest. that puts you precisely amidst the establishment, in the manner in which Farage has framed it. And, from the way that I see it, is a huge national stage that the Green Party could run on and talk about what they're concretely going to do for the working class. It doesn't matter whether they get 10%. They still have that platform, and they can still promote those ideas, but they've eschewed it completely. So it seems a bit weird to me.
I think if you're Zach Polanski, you're the only leader of a major party not in parliament, right? You have espoused eco-populism with a degree of success for the last 6 months or so. Why not test your chances in Clacton? It's not a constituency the Greens are ever going to be expected to win. It's not their demographic base. Far from it, in fact. So the expectations are very, very low. Why not say, I'm going to get some media time by taking the fight to Farage, which is what Labour are not doing. It's it's a strange decision. We'll see if it does delegitimise the by-election itself, not having a major candidate. I'm not entirely sure. I think there are a couple of wider points to be made though on the by-election itself and the circumstances surrounding reform. I think that there's a couple of things going on. One is that reform haven't been able to carve out their place as the new party of the British ruling class yet, right? The British ruling class is fragmented. It's not a unitary thing, right? And so if you look at this perfect example, right? You look at the places where Farage's dodgy donations come from. It's crypto bros, right? It's the new establishment. It's the sort of like boisterous sort of former aristos who are making their money in illicit finance, dark money. It's not the what we might think of when we say the word establishment, right? It doesn't conjure up images of Christopher Harborne, that word. It might conjure up the images of George Cottrell, because I mean his grandfather was a baron and his mother did date the king, but nonetheless his fortune now, we are led to believe, is from illicit finance and crypto. So I think that Reform's inability to establish themselves as the premier party of the British ruling class leads to this clash, right? Where you do get excessive scrutiny of Nigel Farage from quarters where he might not have expected it. The Sunday Times being one, the paper of record of this country, right? Which would be much more content probably with Kemi Badenoch in charge of the British state than Nigel Farage, right? And I think that that's what we're beginning to witness. And maybe some of our institutions are not quite ready for the political revolution which Farage promises. And I mean the right-wing political revolution that Farage promises, and I mean our right-wing institutions.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think part of that, part of the reason for that is to do with Restore UK, because as we saw in the recent Manchester by-election with Andy Burnham, Restore got 7 or 8% of the vote, and their vote could have made a difference, I think, if I remember correctly, in the election. And now, and it's not just the percent, but the thing is, the problem for Reform posed by Restore is not just the percentages they're going to take in elections, it's the fact that they feel the need to communicate to that wing of the right-wing movement that Restore is capturing, instead of communicating to the wider country in such a way that they could, pull in the mainstream Conservative vote and replace the Conservative Party, which has always been Farage's ambition. So that's part of that reason, I think, why they've maybe hit that ceiling. In my view.
I think so too. I think there's another point as well in the fact that it's funny, isn't it, how since the Scottish Parliament election, the cross-fertilisation between Reform in Scotland and Reform in the UK has totally stopped, right? Like the idea that Thomas Kerr and Malcolm Offord want Farage to do this, that they want him in Clacton contesting a by-election potentially against a Bin. Of course they don't, right? And I think it is interesting that him having been in Scotland so much in the run-up to May, you had Richard Tice up, you had Robert Jenrick, I believe, up at least once, maybe not Jenrick, but certainly Tice and Farage, right? These figures, David Bull, for example, hosting these big rallies in Aberdeen, and then you get this election, you get 17 Reform MSPs, and then almost nothing from the Central Party in terms of interventions north of the border. And I wonder if there's a sort of growing grudge with Thomas Cale, with Malcolm Offord, that says actually Farage doing things like this is a weight on us north of the border. And that's interesting in the context of Reform's success in this Larkhall by-election this week, which we should touch on as well. The Larkhall by-election is, of course, a council by-election, takes place in a staunchly unionist part of the country where you wouldn't expect the SNP to do particularly well, where you would expect Reform to do well. But nonetheless, it was a pretty resounding victory for the party midweek, which saw Reform win the first preference vote outright with 35.2%. The SNP comes second with 29.9% and Labour in third with 24.5%. But a very big drop in support for Labour and the Tories, suggesting their vote has gone directly to Reform. 8.5% drop-off for Labour and a 14% drop-off for the Tories. Sam, what did you make of that result?
Well, my thoughts on this aligned actually quite a lot with the comment that you just made about Reform, and I'll explain, hopefully it's clear why. So in the national media, there's this big furor and there's this big outrage about Farage and alleged corruption, alleged dodgy dealings, and Reform brand is not looking great at the moment. Meanwhile, they win their second council election in Scotland, if I'm right, on a low turnout, it should be mentioned, but they did win. There's never huge turnout for a council by-election, so that's to be expected. The takeaway for me is this: there's an attitude from some that I've spoken to that Reform dissipates if Farage is taking down some pegs, and that it's a movement, mostly sustained by his charismatic leadership. And we may see about that in the course of this by-election. But I'd like to ask, what if that's not the case? And I'm the first person to say that Reform may have hit ceiling of popular support. That they might have already reached that ceiling. And I think that Farage actually being the figurehead of the party, and particularly his affiliation to Trump, in my view, might have played a role in hitting the ceiling. But, my point is, what if, irrespective of how damaged Farage becomes, Reform activists have been doing the groundwork required to become entrenched in communities? Then we're entering a very different territory entirely, actually, with far-right politics in the UK, because running councils, representing constituencies in Parliament, managing local branches, organizing meetings, that's how you institutionalize a party. And once it becomes institutionalized, then you can start to generate political experience and political talent, and you underpin an agenda and a project that can outlive, any one political figure, secure wins in Scotland. They can secure wins in Scotland even if Reform top brass are taking big losses of various forms in England, right? And I think that this council by-election should actually be seen as evidence of that process underway.
I think it's a really, really, really good point, right? And I think it's something that you could make the Clacton comparison, right? In the sense that I think what Farage and the rest of them are doing just now is base building, right? I think they probably acknowledge they have a ceiling that they are going to hit at some point if they haven't hit already. And if you think about it in the context of Clacton, right? Say he does not have a major candidate contesting him. What he does get is incredible data, right? You're going to have Reform canvassers on every door. They're going to know exactly who's going to vote for Reform and who's not, which means come that second by-election, in the event the Parliamentary Standards Committee does suspend Farage and that triggers a second by-election in Clacton later in the year, Reform's data is going to be miles ahead of everyone else's. And as we've seen in these by-election campaigns, data is increasingly important, increasingly critical to winning them. So I think in some ways you're exactly right, Sam, and developing that base, cohering that base, is a buffer against the winds that are going to sweep Reform in various different directions, as we're seeing with some of the scandals around Farage. I think it's noticeable that it isn't something that Reform spokespeople have defended particularly well. It's a hard thing to defend, right? But Leila Cunningham, Robert Jenrick, generally pretty competent media performers, right? Particularly in an environment which isn't particularly hostile to them on some of these mainstream channels, just haven't been able to put up a defence of Farage. And I think when you can no longer do that, when your most dependable spokespeople are no longer capable of setting out your case, what you need is foot soldiers. And I think building those networks seems to be the approach. And interesting in Scotland, of course, in the context of council elections in 10 months' time. Because the prospect of reform holding serious sway in city chambers across the country is now quite substantive. And I think that should cause concern for us. In Glasgow in particular, because moving on to our final story in the last 5 minutes of the show, we should talk about the spate of, as you said earlier, Sam, aggressive protests which have swept peripheral areas within the city in recent days. We have seen large protests in Royston, in Cranhill, in Springburn. We've seen organised protests which ultimately didn't take place in Postle Park as a result of misinformation. There was a Facebook group peddling the idea that a care home was set to become an asylum hotel that required Glasgow City Council to publicly deny that was going to happen to take the sting out of rising tensions in that particular part of the city. And I know that because we both live in Glasgow, Sam, sometimes we talk too much about the city as opposed to other places, but I do think it's worth focusing on these protests because of what they signify, because of the numbers and scale of them, which is not insignificant at all. I mean, we're talking about hundreds of people, certainly in Springburn the other night. As you said earlier, these protests have been characterised by a variety of chants. We've seen White Lives Matter banners, some really quite sinister stuff. Sam, what did you make of this situation?
Yeah, so it's obviously quite distressing when you see protests that turn aggravated. They do turn violent. They have turned violent to some extent. I think that 5 police officers were injured this week. 2 men were arrested for attacking police at some of these demonstrations. You hate to see this kind of like disruption and conflict in communities in Glasgow. I think there was, as you say, there was another protest in Springburn on Friday. The group Patriotic Alternative were there with their Scotland for the Scots banner, and as you mentioned, there was a White Lives Matter banner also on display. Police Scotland have said that one of the protests, I think it might have been the Cranhill one, but worth fact checking that for our listeners, and that one of the protests was motivated by an instance of mistaken identity due to misinformation. There was a belief that an individual in the community that had just moved there was a sex offender, and that was a falsehood. And Police Scotland have also made statements, implying that these, suggesting quite clearly that they believe that these protests might be being orchestrated by people out with Glasgow and maybe even out with the central belt of Scotland. The Ferret, as I mentioned earlier, reported that several activist groups from England are going to come to support future demonstrations quite soon. And one English activist, I think, was arrested in Glasgow this week for an alleged hate crime at one of these demonstrations. But I would caution against characterizing, these kinds of mobilizations as totally astroturfed, right, by outside actors. I think that's an inaccurate characterization. You can't just astroturf hundreds of people onto the streets of Springburn, just like that, right? I think it's clear that the politics and the sentiment which is motivating these kinds of mobilizations and the far right street movement as a whole in Scotland, these politics are indigenous. They're not just, stimulated from the outside. But I also think that these incidents are taking place, will continue to see more of them because of the growing kind of deepening networks of national coordination, basically, by highly motivated political actors, and politically sympathetic social media algorithms and misinformation are definitely help this movement. They're part of it, but I don't think we can say that they're the sole cause. And I think that we risk describing it as ephemeral, if we just describe it as an online, an online phenomenon. And we might think that it, might just go away, which I don't think it will. And so the question is, what should be really the response and the tactics of the left, right? Considering this. And I don't think I'm necessarily the person to prescribe that, to be honest, but there are various things I think that should be done. But I do think that the counter demonstrations being organized by the kind of anti-fascist movement in Glasgow are important. I think they're one element. They get news coverage. They very often show a majority counter protest. They also juxtapose the aesthetic of a quite masculine intimidation, which is part of some of the far right self-presentation. They juxtapose that with a more diverse kind of identifiable majority. But these counter protests are not going to stop this movement, in its tracks. But I do think it certainly kind of challenges the legitimacy of the kind of extreme anti-migrant rhetoric that you see on the streets. And at the same time, it also kind of deepens and expands the left's own political networks within the city, which is really, really important. So this is a practical response, and I think it should be supported, but I don't think counter demonstrations are enough. There needs to be more presence in communities themselves by the left. And I think, we can see that in the outcome of this by-election as well. The right, as you said, I think before we started this program, the right are in places that we're not, So yeah, what's your take? I mean, I'm very interested to hear what you have to say about this, Coll.
Yeah, I'll just say a couple of things before we wind up for this week. I think you're right in the sense that those counter protests are good, but the reality is they don't take place in the locations where these protests are happening, and part of that is because it would be harder to get the numbers that you get for counter protests organised in the city centre in some of these outlying areas. I think there are a couple of threads that have run through our entire show today, from Rupert Lowe and Dunblane at the top to what we're talking about now, and you're right to link them together, Sam, right? I mean, Rupert Lowe appears on Joe Rogan probably as a result of his proximity to Elon Musk. We know that Musk and Rogan are close. We know Musk has been on the Rogan show more than once, and we know that Musk is funneling a lot of money to Rupert Lowe and Restore Britain. Now, what does Rupert Lowe use that platform to do but diminish and rewrite Scottish history, right? Pretty important, seminal bits of recent Scottish history in the case of Dunblane. And I think this feeds an argument about misinformation, right? And I think sometimes we misunderstand misinformation, and we see it as something which can be, which is fairly innocent, right? Which is about falsehoods, which is about a failure of an effort to tell the truth. And we see the BBC and other institutions as an antidote to that, right? But I think misinformation is actually, in this case, something far more sinister. Misinformation has a political objective, right? It's not peddling a falsehood for the sake of it. It's peddling a falsehood for the sake of whipping up hate and anti-migrant racist sentiment across Scotland. And I think noting that is particularly important. I think the invocation as well of women and girls in the case of a lot of these protests is really grim. And we know it's really grim because we know the kind of people who align themselves with the far right in Britain, and we know their treatment of women to be appalling. I think something like, I've got it here actually, according to End Violence Against Women police data from the aftermath of the 2024 summer riots, found that 1 in 5 of those arrested had since been reported for domestic abuse. Right, so 1 in 5 of the people arrested during that summer of discontent of 2024, since arrested again, are reported for domestic abuse, and yet these are the people who walk around talking about protecting our women and girls. But pointing out hypocrisy obviously isn't enough to get past this situation. I mean, I remember a time not so recently when people would look at the riots in England and say this kind of thing would never happen in Scotland. Right? It was a political point at the time. It was part of our national discourse that people would point out that there's no way a migrant hotel could ever be burnt down in Scotland because we just don't do that. And increasingly, we're on that path, and that is a damning indictment on all of our decision makers, really. And with regards to the question of what we do, we have as you say, we have a legitimacy problem as the left. And we don't have the resources or the networks that people organising these protests seem to have been able to draw on to grow their reach. But the reality too is that we're not as connected as we like to think we are in some of these parts of the city, unfortunately. And I think that's probably an important note to end on. It's been a very, very good conversation. We'll have Rory back next week. There'll be 3 of us. A bit Glasgow-centric perhaps towards the end, but hopefully listeners will forgive us that, given the importance of the stories we discussed. Many thanks to Sam for joining me. Thanks to you for listening. If you've enjoyed the podcast, you can support Scotia on Patreon for the price of an expensive coffee, and subscribe to our WhatsApp channel and our mailing list. We shall see you next week. Bye for now.